I think we're live.
Okay, let's do it. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Jane Jacobson. I'm the president of the Northern California Hadassah region, which encompasses all of Northern California. I want to welcome everyone to this installment of Defining Zionism in the 21st Century, live from California. If there's anyone who is joining us who hasn't joined our series before, let me explain that the Hadassah's Defining Zionism series was developed to create
That's how it's picking our sound.
Hadassah's Defining Zionism series was developed to create a welcoming opportunity for everyone to explore Zionism through a variety of perspectives. There are many different definitions of Zionism, and we don't all agree with those definitions. But the goal of our program is to create a safe space so we can have open conversations and really explore different perspectives in a respectful and constructive way. We ask that you listen and are respectful during this conversation in your comments and your questions, as well as when you continue your conversation online and in your local community. As a reminder, we encourage you to ask questions via the live stream chat box, which you see on your computer screen. Please register through live stream if that function isn't already enabled on your computer. We're so pleased to have Rabbi Melissa Weintraub with us today. She'll be talking about reforming Israel advocacy, listening as a precondition to being heard. Rabbi Weintraub is an educator and thought leader who trains leaders and builds programs at the intersections of Israel, Jewish thought, and conflict resolution. Among other projects, Rabbi is currently spearheading the Jewish Council for Public Affairs' new civility initiative, working to transform communal norms around Israel and other charged issues, from tension and avoidance to productive deliberation across political divides. She was the founding director of Encounter, an organization dedicated to strengthening the capacity of the Jewish people to be the agents of change in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. She helped build Encounter into an internationally recognized organization and was awarded the Grinnell Young Innovator for Social Justice Prize, honoring individuals who have demonstrated extraordinary accomplishments in effecting social change. Rabbi Weintraub has lectured and taught in hundreds of Jewish communal institutions, universities, and forums, and is a faculty member for the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. She was ordained as a conservative rabbi at the Jewish Theological Seminary and graduated summa cum laude from Harvard University. Rabbi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jane. I hope, given that the spirit of this talk is listening, that our tech will enable everyone to be able to hear me and for me to be able to hear your questions as well. And I want to start by acknowledging and thanking Hadassah for this forward-looking series, opening up discussion and a rethinking of Zionism, particularly generational shifts in this sphere, which I'll touch on in my talk. So let's take a moment to zoom out from the many efforts underway to reframe, redefine, and rebrand Zionism. Many of these efforts are driven by a desire to articulate a compelling vision that will appeal to younger generations, progressives, and other disengaged, uninformed, alienated, skeptical, and critical audiences. And I often hear from those who wish that these efforts had wider and stronger impact. Israel advocates trying to share things that mean so much: love of Israel, deep values and convictions, a story of our people that we believe that the world needs to hear that is so often distorted and maligned. We want to fill in gaps of ignorance. We want to inspire. And we're often at a loss, confused and frustrated when not heard by people that we believe should be our natural allies. So today I'm going to share why I believe many visions for Zionism are not heard by some of the audiences we most want to reach and what might be more effective. I'm going to share an approach drawing from a decade of experience as a rabbi, Israel educator, and facilitator of dialogue among people with dramatically divergent points of view, from national religious settlers to anti-occupation activists, evangelical Zionists to mainline Protestants to mainstream Jewish leaders to Palestinians living in the West Bank. I've traveled in my work through many diverse worlds. And what I've learned and what I want to share is not new. It's in fact old wisdom, but wisdom that I think is much needed in this context. In fact, the original self-help blockbuster already said most of what I want to say this evening, and I'm not going to bury the lead. Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, what Amazon calls the grandfather of all people skills books, written in 1937, says in a nutshell, if you want to win people to your way of thinking, listen to them deeply. See their point of view honestly. Show respect for their opinions. Appeal to their noblest motives and arouse in them an eager want. Dozens, if not hundreds, of books have carried on in this genre since the 1930s. I recently picked up a corporate book on persuasion that culminates in the authors saying they once trained their employees to make great elevator pitches. Now they train their employees to better listen, to ask great questions, and to create openings to dialogue by the end of those same elevator rides. These capacities, skillful listening, reflecting one's audience in terms of their aspirations and concerns, are currently weak, if not lacking, in many efforts to promote Zionism, which is why I believe many fall flat. And my message today, which I will expand on and elaborate on piece by piece, is that if we wish to reach the audiences that aren't already with us, we can't just find the right frame, the right message, the right pitch. We need to listen profoundly, and more importantly, to demonstrate that we've heard. Let me explain. In a 2011 piece called The Science of Why We Don't Believe in Science, journalist Chris Mooney analyzes the human tendency toward confirmation bias or motivated reasoning. That is our ingrained inclination to dismiss, undermine, or simply ignore facts and evidence, even if overwhelming, that don't conform to our pre-existing beliefs. A number of studies have demonstrated that, in Mooney's words, we tend to apply fight or flight reflexes not only to predators, but to data itself. That is, information we find threatening, facts that challenge our assumptions and prior commitments, we do all we can to push away. And conversely, we embrace non-threatening information, assuming as a matter of course that evidence supporting what we already think must certainly be true. This has been well documented with respect to issues from affirmative action to abortion, to gun control, to climate change, to vaccines, to, of course, Israel, along with perhaps every other charged social issue. Subjects overwhelmingly discredit or disregard facts that contradict their biases, regardless of their ideology or their educational levels, when literally hit over the head with instructions to be unbiased in how they field information, they invariably fail, doing all kinds of mental acrobatics to explain what doesn't fit into their prior storylines. In a book called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt describes how people tend to align themselves with a particular social and political team and get, in his words, ensnared in its moral matrix. They see confirmation of their grand narrative everywhere, and it becomes difficult, if not impossible, according to Haidt, to convince them that they're wrong if you argue with them from outside their moral matrix. In fact, Often head-on arguments only backfire, triggering people to hold on to their views more tenaciously than ever. So Mooney and Haidt's pieces go a long way to explaining why many common Israel advocacy tactics, debates, education efforts, trying to prove that others are misinformed and that we are right, don't work very well, if what we want is for people who don't already agree with us to hear us. And Mooney offers one tantalizing guideline for what to do instead. One thing is becoming clear, he says. If you want someone to accept new evidence, make sure to present it to them in a context that doesn't trigger a defensive emotional reaction. A context that doesn't trigger a defensive emotional reaction on Israel. Whoever heard of such a thing, right? When it comes to Israel, people often have their hackles up in advance, even when they're only minimally invested. Even a lot of what masks as apathy among millennials, in fact, seems to be fear and or rejection of being lectured to or labeled. And anything that smacks of you're telling me what to think, for this demographic tends to produce defensiveness and distrust. Now picture in contrast, sitting and talking with those who know you best, who understand you, who at least sincerely try to, those people in your life, your closest friends, perhaps your spouse, who make a point of giving you the benefit of the doubt, who try to understand where you're coming from, who care and want to know what you care about and why. Psychologists call this state of being feeling felt. When we feel felt, we're in the opposite of that defensive state of mind that gives rise to motivated reasoning. We're the most open version of ourselves, the most flexible and receptive in our thinking. This insight is exactly, I think, what Mooney is getting at in concluding that to speak persuasively to those with whom we disagree or those who are not already on our social or political team, we must disarm their defensiveness. Or in the vocabulary of Jonathan Haidt, we must, to be heard, step into the moral matrices of others, transcend our own grand narrative and terms. This is, I believe, the simple wisdom that Dale Carnegie identified and captured roughly 75 years ago in How to Make Friends and Influence People. Put all these insights to use, combine them, which I will do in a moment, and we have the first step of a winning strategy for being heard. In a context as highly charged as Israel, whenever we're speaking to someone who isn't already with us, defenses are likely to go up quickly, and with them, motivated reasoning. So if we want to reach those who aren't already with us, we have to make people feel felt. When what we're doing is making a case, no matter how persuasive or inspiring, how right or true our message, if we haven't made our audience feel felt, it simply will not land because we'll meet with motivated reasoning on the other side. That means more than talking points and messaging. To be effective, advocates need training, back to Dale Carnegie, in how to listen deeply, see the point of view of their audience honestly, show respect for their opinions and aspirations, appeal to their noblest motives, and arouse in them an eager want. And that means changing the whole game around Israel advocacy in terms of both substance and delivery to set the stage for being heard with openness and trust. So let me give you two tangible examples from my own experience of what I mean. One of addressing a group of progressive Jesuits, one of teaching young Jewish social justice activists. A couple of years ago, I spoke alongside Anna Balzer, who's been one of the leading unofficial spokespeople for the BDS movement in the US. She's appeared on TV more than 100 times, including on The Daily Show, and given hundreds of presentations at universities and churches. And I was invited to speak at a Jesuit university alongside her when the university administration turned to the local ADL and JCRC and asked for a Jewish speaker to counter Anna. So these communal leaders, to their credit, decided rather than the usual point-counterpoint acrimonious debate, they wanted to try something new that they hoped would be more effective. Here's what happened. First, what I didn't do. I didn't turn to this audience, most of whom were more sympathetic to Palestinian than to Israeli narrative. And I didn't make a case for or ask them to embrace Zionism in any form. I did not refute honest facts, evidence, or sources by providing a litany of Palestinian rejectionism, intransigence or aggression, or a history of Israel's outstretched hand in peace. I did not intimate that anyone in this audience was a delegitimizer or would become one if they chose to support BDS or if they chose to strongly condemn Israeli policy. I tried not to blame or shame. I believe doing any of these things would have shut the door to being heard. Those not already aligned with Anna would have likely seen us both as two lawyers duking it out, trying to get a verdict best for our client with a highly selective presentation of facts. And they would have been pretty cynical and suspicious of everything that I had to say as a result. I instead tried to tune into this audience's moral compass and terms. I knew that most in this audience saw it as their religious responsibility, inspired by Catholic social teaching, to bring justice to the vulnerable and freedom to the oppressed. I knew that most saw Israelis and Palestinians in oppressor-oppressed terms, with a clear imbalance of both power and injustice. And so I tried to demonstrate to this audience, not cosmetically or glibly, I get it. I get where you're coming from. Like Anna, I've spent years among Palestinians. I've seen their humiliation and suffering. I've seen Israel through Palestinian eyes. I get your outrage. I get your concern. And that what drives you to it is nothing inflammatory or immoral, let alone anti-Semitic, but rather your deepest and highest ideals. Rather than rebuke them, I tried to get to the moral core of what mattered to them and present them with an exciting invitation. The things you're aspiring to attain, dignity, freedom, fairness, your values will be better fulfilled another way. Not through blame-assigning vilification, not through solidarity with one side in service of justice, but through solidarity with all sides, all human beings in service of justice. I didn't reframe or rebrand Zionism for them, but rather reframed what they cared about, Israeli-Palestinian relations and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as a system of conflict rather than as a system of oppression, which is how they saw it. I tried to show them how they might intensify violence and obstacles to justice and peace by extending exclusive empathy and recognition to Palestinians and not to Israelis. Joel Brownold, in a wonderful article in Haaretz, has pointed out the parallel universes in which the very terms that Israelis and Palestinians and those in solidarity with them tend to use when talking about this conflict and talking past each other, with the Israeli camp commonly referencing peace, coexistence, and security, and the Palestinian camp deploying terms commonly like justice, rights, and freedom. I didn't talk past this audience by speaking about peace and coexistence, let alone the threats Israelis live under, Israel's security needs, or even Israel's right to exist. I did try to offer insight into what it feels like to be Israeli at a human level in a way that aligned with their fundamental values of justice, freedom, empathy, and human dignity. I tried to build empathy irrespective of agreement for Israeli suffering and aspirations. And I tried to show the self-defeating impact demonizing Israel might have on the very redemptive goals they sought, and to show that they would best realize those ideals and goals by becoming neither pro-Palestinian nor pro-Israel, but rather pro-solution. In other words, I stepped into their moral matrix, which is much easier to do in the abstract and hypothetical than it is in the tangible. I tried to make them feel felt. I disarmed their defensiveness by showing respect for their opinions, appealing to their noblest motives, and arousing in them an eager want. The audience was taken. The event's organizers said I had approached the conflict with so much balance they wished I had been the only speaker. The Jewish communal leaders said that this was the most effective response to BDS they'd ever seen. So let me return to my core message. more effective than training people in talking points, thinking if only we build the perfect Zionist frame. More effective would be training advocates in how to better understand and demonstrate that understanding of target audiences and create openings to reciprocal relationship. We don't need better elevator pitches. We need better capacity to listen, to ask the right questions, to create pathways to connection and dialogue. Doing so will maximize the likelihood that what we have to say will land, be taken to heart even by those initially distant from what we have to say. Now, the words two-way relationship and dialogue here are pivotal. I couldn't have said anything resonant to this audience if I hadn't spent more time listening than on panels or giving webinars, trying to create a rich understanding of the people I addressed and how they see themselves, how they tell their own story. I couldn't have been effective if I hadn't listened to Catholics and Protestants trying to walk the path of Jesus, Palestinians living in humiliation, and Israelis living in embattlement and fear. I couldn't have been successful if I hadn't been genuinely dialogical. That is, if I'd only been trying to butter up my audience in order to manipulate and co-opt them, in order to win. If I had only been trying to be smart enough to subsume them to my cause rather than hold myself open to remaining in dialogue. And the thing with dialogue is that if we actually truly engage in it, we run the risk that we too might be changed. That just as we may challenge the judgments of others, so too we may need to revise our own. That those with whom we speak just may reframe Zionism for us. So now let me touch on how this approach might work and play itself out with alienated next-gen Jews, drawing observations from a few studies in order to see if we can reconstruct elements of their moral matrix to inform engagement strategies. One study stands out in particular, a now classic one called Israel in an Age of M&M, commissioned in 2003 by the Andrea and Charles Bronfman Philanthropies to try to understand responses to Israel advocacy marketing among Jews under the age of 35. Two core principles emerge from this study and similar research in terms of what's needed in the field. The first deals with process. In short, in all of these studies, young Jews pointed to wanting inclusive, open, respectful conversation about Israel, which I understand this Hadassah series is a part. They want honest recognition of our people's diversity of opinion and avenues for productive engagement across those differences that don't try to smooth them over in false unity or pretenses of consensus. They see much of the current advocacy climate on campus and beyond, ridden with tension or groupthink or avoidance of whatever is difficult as repellent. The second related principle is more a question of content than of process. Young Jews want to be exposed to a multiplicity of perspectives and narratives on core issues, and I'll flesh this out in a few moments. So at levels of both process and content, young Jews want to explore the significance and challenges of Israel without being told what to think. And explore is really the operative word here. They're allergic to any agenda that isn't open-ended. They are hypersensitive to being ideologically spoon-fed. To state this point blank, there is simply no way to define Zionism or offer Israel up as either object of inquiry or experience that's compelling or relevant enough to be sold to a generation, and really at this point, multiple generations, that don't want to be sold anything, that want to figure it out for themselves. Now, many communal leaders now give lip service to something John Risquet, the immediate past CEO of the UJA Federation of New York, has talked about, which is decoupling Israel education and advocacy. But we're going to need a truly tectonic shift in what we're currently doing as a community to realize this prescription. As Danny Lehman, president of Hebrew College, has said, true education is open-ended and unpredictable. Michael Oakeshott, the great philosopher of liberal education, has described liberal learning as an endless, unrehearsed intellectual adventure in which, in imagination, we enter into a variety of modes of understanding the world and ourselves and are not disconcerted by the differences, or dismayed by the inconclusiveness of it all. Israel engagement in education to be effective with younger generations must relax from a defense mindset that tries to teach young Jews to win arguments. It must also refrain from behavioral and emotional directives, other than a minimalist definition of participation. That is, our message must be, we want you to be involved, however you choose to be. We must provide a base of knowledge, including of both Israeli and Palestinian narratives and claims. And we must provide a structure of conversation and then hand over the reins and empower young people to define for themselves what their relationship will look like, including how relevant Israel will be to them at all. So returning to the initial two principles I gleaned, which I'll summarize as inclusivity in process and multiplicity in content, I'm going to add a third principle, which is ownership. This is an audience that needs to feel like they're the owners of the conversation. They're owning their own exploration. And ultimately, they're owning their own positions. And they're not serving as a tool for anyone else's agenda. Let me make this too more concrete. When I teach young Jews on Israel, if I pose to them a fundamental question like, can the Jewish and democratic parts of the state of Israel be reconciled? I don't respond with a didactic, yes, it can, here's how, according to these three liberal Zionist thinkers. I take seriously at the level of both content and process that this question is incredibly complex and gives rise to diverse approaches among very smart, thoughtful, and ethical people. I may, for example, lay before them some of these complexities in terms of Israel's sources of law, symbols of state, immigration policies, political power structure, and demography. How Israel compares and contrasts not only with liberal democracies like America, but also with those democracies that are identified with a particularistic religion and ethnicity, like England, Germany, and Malaysia. How thinkers on both right and left have exposed real tensions between the Jewish and democratic parts of Israel's self-definition, as well as practical proposals for change. From demands for loyalty oaths on the part of Arab Israeli citizens to demands for recognition of collective national Arab minority rights and better avenues for meaningful political participation and power sharing. Most importantly, I lay this diversity of perspective before them with questions, not with answers. In collaborative and open-ended conversation, not predetermined conclusions. Because what most touches this audience too is not better framing or argument, but rather reciprocity, conversation that allows them, that empowers them to deliberate across the frames we already have and to find their own voices and truths. Now, if we do as I have suggested this evening, listen, see others' points of view, speak to their terms, does this mean we'll go all soft and relativistic, leave Israel undefended and immorality unchecked? There's two things I want to say here. Number one, pluralism, respectful acknowledgement of a diversity of views is not relativism. Empathy, understanding why one might pursue views different than our own, is not agreement. We can acknowledge the moral core and noble aspirations at the heart of divergent views and express a desire to listen, even while sustaining strong disagreement and our own principled stances. Number two, as I have tried to show this evening, doing so is actually the precondition for being heard. Promoting what matters to us, to those who aren't already with us. Two-way relationship is a precondition for effective advocacy. Listening is a precondition to being heard. We will only touch and inspire the skeptical, questioning, and distant, whether mainline Protestants or young social justice activists, when they recognize themselves in the story we tell, when we show that we understand them as they understand themselves, when we say, this is how what I'm calling you to do is there in you already. It's when we give meaningful recognition to what our interlocutors hold sacred, that we hold open the door to recognition, if not embrace, of what is sacred to us, however framed. Thank you. I look forward to hearing, I won't get to hear, but I look forward to reading your questions and responding to them.
Thank you so much. It was an incredible presentation, and I'm sitting here thinking about my life, my Hadassah chapter and region, and how we can move forward some of the concepts that you've presented today, and especially this combining my generation, your generation, and the generations that are behind us. Mm-hmm. And so, do you find that there are a lot of requests from churches, synagogues, mosques to come and share your concepts, to share these thoughts?
Yeah, so I want to actually come back to the first thing you said in a moment, because I want to hear more about what the talk prompted in you about how Hadassah goes about its work. I'd love to hear more about that, and for others to get to hear that, since I know this is a Hadassah audience. Right. But yes, I think right now, people have asked me this summer, how did this summer change things? And what the escalation and this heartbreaking dark summer that we had. Absolutely. And in terms of the internal Jewish conversation and the broader American public discourse around Israel, what I found is that it actually just intensified and brought to awareness the importance of people being the sense that people are living in parallel universes and echo chambers and silos that are talking past one another now and then, colliding in frustration and hostility, that people don't understand each other's terms is so profound now, so acute. And so even though there's a small part of the community that felt unprecedented unity this summer, most people, what they experienced was unprecedented polarization. And so what I've experienced is that there is just a tremendous hunger, a ubiquity of hunger for within communities, whether we're talking about synagogues or Hillels or JCCs, and also across communities, for people to have support and help to be able to relate to and give recognition to each other's terms. Okay, now I want to rewind and ask you, because you said this was making you think about Hadassah here and about how you go forward with your work, and I'd love to hear what it made you think about.
Well, I know that you were in my local area a few months ago, 2 weeks ago, making a presentation, and from the feedback I got, which was mostly from people, my peers, it was very well presented, and there was a lot of discussion generated. And so my hope is to expand on that and to bring in, somehow reach out to the various generations and bring them in so that they'll be able to participate in this kind of a discussion more and learn this whole concept of listening well and listening deeply. And I know there are a lot of discussion groups in our area between Christians, Jews, and Muslims. And my hope is that they are successful. And it might be that it's one-on-one, it's one person at a time. It's a very slow process. But we need to move it forward.
I think in some ways we've given more attention to interfaith dialogue than we have to intergenerational dialogue within our own community. And there needs to be a lot of structures and intention poured into intergenerational dialogue. What I find in terms of intergenerational dialogue on Israel is that people just simply sit in a room and share their stories of what are the moments of importance to you in terms of shaping your relationship to Israel. And one person is in their 70s and one person is in their 20s. They just have such profound life experiences and different relationships to the history of what has taken place over this last century. And I think it would be game-changing, actually, for more people to be having those conversations. We did an intergenerational conversation recently. When I say we, the JCPA Civility Initiative, with lay leaders, board members of the URJ, and nifty regional president. So, it was a very broad span of ages. And people sharing their life experiences, one person saying 1967 was, of course, the moment that shaped that whole generation, not just one person, for many people, right? And others talking about the Intifada or the building of the separation barrier being what shaped the lens and sensibility through which they see Israel. So markedly different in turn. When people have that kind of conversation, they produce a kind of much more nuanced relationship to the challenges that Israel confronts often than can emerge without them communicating with each other. So I don't know if people are writing in with questions, but we could, of course, continue this over here.
For a long time, I'll tell you. I would love to know whether the JCPA would be the conduit for expanded work with this multi-generational, or even with the younger generation. And we live in the Bay Area, but is there the same opportunity in different parts of the country?
So the JCPA Civility Initiative works all over the country, yes. Multi-generational dialogue is one prong of what we do. There's not a lot of shortcuts to changing the ways people communicate around Israel. It doesn't come from someone giving a panel presentation or a webinar, right? It comes from the kind of thing that Jane referenced, me doing a workshop in the Silicon Valley. That was actually a 5-hour-long workshop in which people were really building their muscles to do what I'm talking about here. Because we can commit to listening, but it's very different to practice listening to someone who's saying things that are tremendously hard to hear. Practice shifting from reactivity into curiosity. Practice asking questions when we feel defensive. Practice demonstrating that we've actually heard instead of just leading with our own lens and our own sensibility. That's the kind of thing that we do again and again in different workshops. We can't be everywhere at once. We're facing much more demand than we can supply. And we're in the process of deepening our bench of people who...
Well, that's what I want to know, is that there is more supply than there is, more demand than there is supply, which in a way is good, but we have to just build up more leaders like you who can go out and make these presentations and really educate on this topic. So, I must say, are there any questions that are being generated from our listening audience? The Rabbi and I can go on with a very specific conversation, but I hope that there are some questions that will be coming in. So, basically then, I want to thank you again for our conversation and for joining us. You have been a wonderful addition to this series, and we've enjoyed it. I want to remember everyone out there listening that this session has been recorded, just like all of our previous sessions. They can be viewed alone by you, or you can invite your friends. If you're in an organization, you can invite your organization to come and watch it with you, and it will certainly generate a wonderful discussion. If you enjoyed this session, consider inviting others to watch this online rescreening. Please continue this conversation on our website at www.hadassah.org/Zionism discussion, and on Twitter using the hashtag defining Zionism. Our next session will be on Wednesday, November 12th, 2014 at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time and 4:30 p.m. Pacific Time. Our speaker on that day will be Rabbi Joshua Weinberg, president of the Associate Reformed Zionists of America, or known as ARTZA. He will be discussing Living Here, Loving There, Is American Zionism an Oxymoron? Additionally, if you haven't done so already, please consider registering for the entire Defining Zionism series so that you'll receive updates about all our future programs. Please share your feedback with us by completing our online survey. Your responses help us create additional programming that is of interest to you and to your communities. Special thanks to all the volunteers and staff involved in the Defining Zionism program, without whom these presentations would not be possible? I see some questions coming in, so I'm not going to, okay. I guess one says don't stop yet. There are questions coming in. How can these tools be applied or be used by interactions with the media? That's a great question.
So I see a bunch of different questions here, actually. There's a question here about how this can be applied in relation with the media. There's a question about red lines. Okay. So, and another question about how to de-escalate confrontation. So I'll start with the latter. I have least to say about media, so I may as well turn to it last. So in terms of, so someone asked, how can confrontation be de-escalated when things are about to get heated? The best answer that I have to that is to be preemptive. There's so much that can be done in terms of how to structure a forum, in terms of what can be done before creating a process to preempt hostility in the room, from communication agreements, that guidelines and asking people to make commitments to how they're going to speak to each other. I've moved more and more away from communication agreements in the way that I do this work, in part because I find that it often is stultifying in relation to conversation, that people don't speak in a raw way because they're tiptoeing around each other and they're afraid that they're going to do it wrong. And what I find is actually that the greater danger than heat and tension is people just not going there. People coming into the room and staying where it's safe and staying where they agree, staying where they have commonality, and not talking through some of the really meaty issues that they want to engage. And so a lot of the work that I do in structuring a forum, that we do in structuring forums, is about actually surfacing disagreements so that people can't have material to work with that they're not avoiding. And we talk about safe enough space rather than safe space, because it's actually risky and not that safe to talk about the things that we disagree on. It can be very scary. It can be threatening, destabilizing. And then providing facilitators who are trained to help people touch those places without getting thrown off their center, without reacting in a way that they can't hear what others have to say. So this is where a lot of our work is focused now, training facilitators to sit in a room and help people move through those charged moments and extend recognition to each other. That is, like I said, there's not shortcuts in that work. There's not a manual we can hand people that's do it yourself that says, follow this recipe. Each person talks for 2 minutes and then does this, and then you're going to have a conversation in which you can touch the things you've been avoiding for years. But we are working on training dozens of facilitators all over the country who can support the kinds of conversations that I'm talking about. And also to put in place institutionally the kinds of culture change in an institution so that people are less afraid of touching their differences and less reactive, so that they can, they have a culture in which we can go there because we know we can hear each other, we can love each other through disagreement. So
are these people being trained? Are they from different schools? Are they what is their age group?
So yeah, that's a great question. There's a big vision, and then there's what we're working with in this moment. Mm-hmm. In large part, in all honesty, because of the funding the way the funding has worked for these training programs. Most of the people that we have thus far trained are in their 20s and 30s, and they are engaged with supporting these kinds of dialogues among the next generation. However, that's going to change in the next year. And we have many of them, first of all, are senior level and able to support conversation for all different age demographics. But we also have plans in the works to have a more senior level bench of people and roster of people, and want to be training rabbis and communal leaders as well, not just mediators and therapists and people who have prior conflict resolution expertise in doing this work. Oh, now I see a lot of questions. So the red lines one is clearly something that is impacting so many people right now. So why don't I touch on that? I used to avoid this question, and I just became much more assertive on it recently because I've really clarified. I think the ways that I believe that red lines, even though they are very much an understandable reaction to this moment of escalation that we came to as a community, I've clarified for myself that I believe that the red lines that our communal institutions have created have done us a lot of damage. I think I couldn't be more eloquent than Daniel Hartman on this. I wish I could quote him directly, and I encourage everyone to read his Times of Israel piece on this question. And he talks about how creating, when we're talking about building an open marketplace of ideas, which is what so many people turn to, especially young people on college campuses, are living in. They want to be living in an open marketplace of ideas. Sending the message that we can't talk about this or that here is really repellent. It sends a message of fear and inability to handle conversation. The idea that you can come as an individual, but you can't be represented in our platform in the public space in terms of who we do or don't invite as speakers. People are not pacified or mollified by that. And I'm not just talking about people whose views are not represented or expressed or recognized in the public space. People who are connected to them or who want to be able to co-sponsor an activity with Palestinians or with a group that is seen as TRAIF, they're also turned off. One metaphor that someone used for this recently to me was, we're not talking about a tent, we're talking about a family. And you can't tell me, yes, you're welcome at the dinner table, you're welcome to come, but if you have preferences in terms of whether our family keeps kosher or is vegan, your preferences can't register, can't be recognized, can't be supported in our family system. It's a very condescending thing to say. And that you can say that maybe to a 7-year-old, maybe not even, but certainly not to an adult who's going to be deliberating with you about what the family looks like. And so I think that we don't need to be afraid and not only do we not need to be afraid, we can't be afraid if we're going to be able to confront the challenges that Israel is facing, and let alone to be appealing to the next generations. I have much more to say about red lines, but I'll keep it with that for now. I think it creates many theaters of the absurd, and I could give many examples. So what else has been asked?
There was a comment about if we're trying to be too PC and we limit our conversation, then doesn't it become dishonest?
Yeah. So that's a great question, and that's part of why I spoke about scrapping the communication agreement. Communication agreements are one of those shortcuts when I can't work with a community or send facilitators. Can always send a communication agreement and say structure things in this or that way. But often what ends up happening is that you create a conversation in which people are holding back. People are polite. They're not actually I think that this is what the PC question gets to. There's a sense of we're actually muzzling ourselves, or we're just not touching the things, opening the things that we most want to talk about here. And the purpose of supporting better communication is helping people probe their disagreements and investigate their disagreements rather than sticking to what's safe. It's actually, in a way, the opposite of safe space, but doing it in a way that supports and strengthens their relationships with each other rather than harms them.
Well, getting down to the basics,
yeah,
we have a question.
Okay.
How do people reach you?
How do people reach me?
Yes, do they do it to the JCPA?
Yes, people can reach me through the JCPA. I'll give that email address, mweintraub@thejcpa.org. it's fine for people to reach out to me there.
Okay, and I know that the Hadassah office in New York also has your contact information. So if anybody didn't get that address, they can contact you through that.
Yeah, I think it's available on the website.
Right. Okay. How do you define Zionism?
So it's interesting in a way that this goes to the heart of my talk. I'm much more interested in creating a forum for people to talk through the respective definitions of Zionism that have been available in Jewish not throughout, but depending on your perspective, throughout Jewish history or in the last 150 years, and empowering people to clarify and discern what they think and how they relate to those definitions than I am with defining Zionism myself. I don't think my definition of Zionism would be that interesting. There's bare bones, uncontentious ways of defining Zionism as the right of the Jewish people to self-determination, or the liberation movement of the Jewish people to be free in its own land. These are common definitions to exercise sovereignty over our own destiny. But this, to me, what's more interesting is to look at and recuperate all of the avenues, as Noam Pianko in his book has talked about, the paths not taken, the various competing understandings of Zionism today, for people to really unpack, just to bring some oxygen to this conversation. Instead of looking for the common ground, you'll hear this refrain throughout everything that I'm saying.
To keep the conversation open.
Yeah, to keep the conversation not just open, but informed by the true diversity of what Zionism means and has meant, political and cultural and binational, etc., all the various forms that Zionism has taken and can take.
Okay. What is the goal of Israel?
What is the goal of Israel?
No.
Is that the question?
No. Somebody here stopped at the Roads Not Taken was a great book. We have somebody from Colorado who would like to find out. That was why she wanted to get your contact information, was so that she could bring something to Colorado, so that she could start some training there. And
there was a dangling question about media.
Yes.
That I think I haven't responded to. So my strong orientation tends to be toward privileging face-to-face communications, to the point that I usually resist even doing webinars because it's hard for me to even be speaking right now and not seeing the faces of the people who are listening and adjusting what I'm saying accordingly. Because to me, even speaking needs to be a form of listening, a give and take, to be effective. And so I've increasingly, especially this summer, steered clear of Facebook and a lot of forums that, even though there's a lot of opportunity in them, also, as so many people have commented on, became just incredibly polarized and fraught and off-putting, and people withdrew into the parallel universes I've been speaking about throughout. And all that said, I think that insofar as one could bring the approach that I've been presenting to work with media, which isn't my work, but perhaps it's someone else's who's listening, I think a lot of that work is about raising invisible stories, lifting up voices that are not usually heard, that transcend the usual categories, boxes of the stereotypes and labels that conflicts tend to produce and intensify, and refusing the single story, and encouraging those who are responsible for media to do so as well. That there's not only one single story of who Israelis are, there's not only one single story of who Palestinians are, ensuring that there is real complexity and sophistication and box-defying depictions of the humanity of people who are actually living in conflict. I'll say one more thing about this. I heard someone talking this week about how story, you don't understand any conflict until you've heard the stories of those living in it. You can read every policy analysis, every abstraction, every history, but until you've heard enough stories to defy all of your analysis to really step into the humanity of the people living in a conflict, you haven't heard anything. And I think our media has a long way to go to tell the stories of the people who are living in this conflict to all of us here, and that we should be holding our media accountable to doing so, as well as our elected officials and clergy and all other leaders.
That last topic is really good. That last sentence that you said about holding people responsible for what they write, showing that is not the case. So the media, that includes television, radio. Have you used those mediums before?
Speaking myself or asking? Yes. Yeah.
But you'd rather do it in a person kind of a presentation? Could you have more conversation?
I always prefer a dialogical setting.
Okay, super. Okay, I think that's about. I think we've responded to most of the questions that we've received, and I want to thank you again. And again, thank all the volunteers who've made this possible. And thank you, thank our volunteers, and thank all of you listeners for sending in your questions and for participating in today's program. Good evening for now.
Bye, everyone. Please be in touch.